So let me talk about my title first, Pussy Politics. Of course, the title has to do with our current political moment and the place of pussies in it. Not only does it have to do with what does it mean to have a president who brags about grabbing pussies and defends this bragging decades later as locker room talk, harking back to a previous period when locker room talk was a moniker for something harmless and inane. And not only, that was, of course, when America was great. Not only do these events make us have to reflect on what it means to have a pussy, as opposed to grabbing one, why grabbing is superior to having, and why both grabbing and having are superior to being. Because, of course, the ultimate political failure is not to grab a pussy or even to have a pussy, it's to be a pussy. So the reference in my title is not only to the reclaiming of this term, which means both female and weak, in the largest display of citizen power that we've ever witnessed in this country, certainly the largest display of people's power ever organized under the banner of the pussy, or the ears of the pussy hat, but also, and this is really the subject of the talk, what kind of role does gender play in the turn to authoritarianism or fascism that we are witnessing now? And how does the billionaire white nationalist alliance that has seized power in our country rely on gender, depend on certain gender formations to justify itself to its supporters? Okay. So in order to talk about that topic, I need to talk about something else first, which is a question that I often hear when I'm traveling out of the country. And the question, however politely phrased, boils down to this: why are Americans so stupid? And what folks mean by that question, however politely phrased, is why do Americans again and again make decisions that are directly contrary to their own material interests? And one reasonable assumption might be that that's about a lack of education. And certainly our educational system in this country is sorely lacking. But I think that we need to really beware of the belief that dumb, redneck, rural, white voters put Trump in office. And I'm using crude terms because I think those epithets are underneath a lot of what we say about who elected this president. Many of them were, we tell ourselves, the same ones who voted unexpectedly for Obama in 2008 and 2012. They must be really stupid if they could both vote for Obama and for Trump. But as was pointed out in an article in the New Republic, rural voters made up only 17% of the entire electorate in this past election. They couldn't have elected Trump all by themselves. And the 58% of white voters who voted for Trump didn't only come from rural areas. If we think about how educated folks voted, many of whom are concentrated in urban areas, if they were any race but white, they overwhelmingly did not vote for Trump. But if they were white, they did. So among college-educated whites, only 39% of men and 51% of women voted for Clinton. So I think we need to consider what's going on, what is this phenomenon that we're witnessing, and how is it that it seems to appeal to the imagination of not only folks without a college education, but also many folks who do have college educations, folks who are in rural areas, also folks who are in urban areas. Also seems to appeal to a lot of women, particularly women who are white, and not very many women who are not white, according to the voting records. I think a mistake that we make is to try and understand how these people are thinking, as if what we're primarily going on in the realm of our conceptual life, or in the realm of our lucid, rational commitments. I think what instead we need to think about is our aesthetic and affective attachments to various structures, but in this talk I'm focused on our aesthetic and affective attachments to certain models of masculinity. So an aesthetic and an affective attachment is something that's lived in the body. It's not lived in the mind first, at least. And because it's lived on this aesthetic and affective level, it's perfectly comfortable with contradictions in the conceptual sphere. So I can believe one thing, but be aesthetically and affectively and viscerally, personally attached to something else. So by that I'm saying that a Trump voter need not buy into the racist and sexist and xenophobic beliefs in order to become passionately attached to Trumpism as a phenomenon. So this is an attachment that's viscerally lived in the space of the imaginary domain. Meant by the imaginary domain, I mean how I understand my place in the world in relation to others, how I know where I belong, what people I belong to, how I know where I am in a world of values, how I know which way's up and which way's down, which things are familiar, which things are strange, and how I know that in a community with others. So what I think, and what I claim in my work, is that gender itself has to be understood in terms of what it does rather than what it is. And one of the most important things that gender does is it provides, it acts as an operation of justification. By that I mean it's a kind of doing rather than a kind of being, and that the ways that we do our gender are also modes of justification of the very worth and value of our lives. So how we are recognized as a particular kind of man or a particular kind of woman, and as a society we're not actually very good at recognizing anything that falls outside those two categories, but how we are recognized in relationship to our gender also establishes, in large part, not exclusively, but establishes our social worth in the eyes of others. So what kind of man or woman we are is received by others and responded to by others as if it's about our social worth. So if gender is about justification in that sense, it's about gender is about justification in two senses. The first sense is that existential sense that I've just described, where how I matter to others and whether I'm valued by others is dependent in large part on my way of doing or being a particular gender. And if you think of adolescent kids who are just trying to establish their adult gender identities, and the level of suicide for those who don't do it successfully in the eyes of their peers, the level of depression and conflict that it causes when someone is not the hot one and the valued one on social media, but is the one that's labeled as worthless. Then I think that helps us get at that existential level of justification. But there's another way that gender is an operation of justification, and that has to do with gender operates in national politics as a justification for economic and material relations that can't find any other justification. And so that's, of course, where I want to go with this talk. Because it's my view that in the United States, we're attached, passionately, viscerally attached, through a long history, to a certain kind of masculinity that I call sovereign masculinity, and that has everything to do with, in fact, a triumph of the will. It's also my contention that an attachment to this kind of masculinity makes us stupid. And I mean that in the literal sense that it makes us unable to actually think through problems and come to conclusions on a rational level. There are reasons for that. This form of masculinity is rooted in a particularly American and particularly racist history that doesn't associate masculinity, in fact, with rationality and the life of the mind, as we commonly think it does, and it does in the European context, but not in the United States. It associates masculinity instead with an introjected kind of primitivity, physicality, that's instinct-driven and contemptuous of the life of the mind, with a certain level of vulgarity. This is a particularly racialized version of masculinity that is taken from its projected version in communities of color and introjected back into the white masculine subject in the progressive era historically. That's way too brief to make that point, but I'm happy to talk more about it. I also think that this form of masculinity, sovereign masculinity, lives in a very close and intimate relationship with shame. Developmentally, it emerges as a reaction formation to shame. Developmentally, the sovereign masculine subject has to pass through shame in order to become sovereign. Think of all the stories of the humiliated boy on the playground who finally punches the bully in the nose, and then he's saved, and his life is suddenly, he's arrived at some form of masculinity that's important. So shame is a necessary part of the developmental formation of this form of masculinity, and shame is eventually converted to power, and that's the central structure of how this masculinity maintains itself. So once that you are, as Corey Browning put it, post-shame, in his talk today, you can no longer be shamed, but you have to shame others all the time in order to keep that shame close, in order to produce the sovereign masculinity that only emerges as an operation of reaction to shame. So the moment of redemption in the formation of sovereign masculinity is usually a moment where there's a hyperbolic display of agency. I mentioned the kid punching the other kid in the nose on the playground, spectacles of violence, also spectacles of wealth. And I think Kenneth Calhoun's presentation on the ostentation of the aesthetic of the Trump regime as a sort of display of spectacular wealth is important here. So these hyperbolic displays of agency are meant to secure an illusion of omnipotence. So here's what I would say about Trump's language. When he engages in blatant displays of racism, which he did when he announced his candidacy, Mexican immigrants are rapists and murderers, blatant displays of sexism, women are dogs and fat pigs, you just have to grab them by the pussy. He says I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and it wouldn't matter. And when you're a star, they let you do it. I'm very rich. I alone can fix it. I don't think it's actually the message of the words that matters here. That's not what's important. What's important is that it's not that Trump supporters cognitively believe the claims that he's making, that Mexicans are rapists and murderers, nor that the appropriate way to interact with women is to grab them by the pussy. What's happening is not happening on the level of belief at all. That's not the level on which these statements are doing their work. What's important about the statements is that they're displays of omnipotence. They awaken then a sort of visceral passion that precedes rather than follows belief. So the aesthetic and affective response to the hyperbolic display of agency is strong enough, maybe even to make someone adopt certain beliefs, because Trump holds them. But it's not what he's saying that's important, it's that he is engaged in a hyperbolic display of agency that evokes this figure of sovereign masculinity. Sovereign masculinity understands itself to be the source of meaning and value. The operation of language in sovereign masculinity is like the operation of language when God speaks, where speech instantiates truth. I am the law and order president, Trump says, and what that means is not that he obeys the law, but that he gives it. He pronounces it. That's why he can't stand that the judiciary is interfering with his decrees, because his decrees should be immediately law. So I would say that sovereign masculinity is at the visceral and affective heart of authoritarianism or fascism, wherever it emerges. Make America great again, that slogan is obviously, that's a structure that we see over and over again in fascist movements. Roger Griffin has suggested that fascism has at its core a myth of national resurrection after a period of alleged decadence. So if there is this imaginary figure of masculine drive and omnipotence, that's a structuring feature of the great American past that has to be resurrected. Every display of omnipotence keys into that visceral embodied attachment to an imaginary figure, which I think is at the heart of American politics. And so, of course, grabbing pussies and bragging about it is simply one more display of omnipotence that evokes that sovereign figure.